5, 4.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel of LGBTQ educators that we are calling Schools Out. My name is Mason Funk. I'm the founder and executive director of the OUTWORDS archive. Our mission is very simple. It is to record, preserve, and share the stories of LGBTQ pioneers and elders across the United States. We do this to build community and catalyze social change. We are really thrilled to be here today with the support of Microsoft, who has been supporting Outwards in our mission over the past couple of years. This year, they determined that they wanted to help us support, in particular, recording the stories of educators from across the country. And we have an amazing panel of people that we'd like to share with you. Before I go any further, I want to make a land acknowledgement. Outwards stands in solidarity with all of California's indigenous people. We acknowledge that our headquarters in Los Angeles are located on the occupied traditional lands of the Tongva people, who are the past, present, and future stewards of this land. We commit ourselves and our work to developing relationships and cultural competencies to uphold and support Native sovereignty. So I've told you a bit about Outwards. I want to say again, thanks to Microsoft for their support of this program. Effectively, what their support entailed this year was, you all can probably imagine, when the pandemic began, we suddenly could no longer interview people in person. So we shifted to recording online interviews. It actually enabled us to reach people much more quickly in places across the country. And the three people you're going to meet today, two of them have been recorded, two of their interviews were recorded virtually over the past year. One of them, Loraine Hutchins, was interviewed 5 years ago on Outward's first ever East Coast swing, starting in Washington, D.C. and working our way up to Maine. We're gonna meet the panelists in just a couple of minutes here, but first, we have a couple of videos that we want to share with you. The videos are a little confusing, and I'll explain why. We originally interviewed 3 educators this year to be part of this panel. Their names are Bigham, Elaine Brune, and Shanna Peoples, and that was going to be this panel. However, at the last minute, Shanna found herself unable to participate in this panel event. So we scratched our heads for about 5 seconds and said, who else could be a great addition to this panel? And we immediately thought of Loraine Hutchins, whom, as I mentioned, we interviewed 5 years ago in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to briefly mention the 4 people who you're going to see in these videos. You're going to see Brett, Elaine, and Shanna in the first video compilation, and then you'll see a separate video of just Loraine. But let me tell you who you're going to meet. You're going to meet Brett Bigham, who's a special education teacher, and he was named 2014 Oregon Teacher of the Year. You're going to meet Shanna Peoples, who is a middle and high school English teacher from Amarillo, Texas, who was named 2015 National Teacher of the Year. And again, in that first video, you're going to also meet Elaine Brune, who's a retired teacher and high school assistant principal in St. Louis, Missouri, where they currently serve as board president of the Metro Trans Umbrella Group. Then, in the separate video that will follow immediately, you're going to meet Loraine Hutchins, a longtime writer and educator who teaches courses on women's studies, health and sexuality, and LGBT identities at Montgomery College, just outside of Washington, D.C. Now, before we get started, the video you're about to watch will make a little bit more sense if I give you a bit of background about Brett. Brett Bigham was an openly gay special education teacher in the Portland area of Oregon when he was named Oregon Teacher of the Year in 2014. At this time, Brett's district told him he could no longer be openly gay, that effectively he needed to hide his authentic self as he traveled the state and the nation participating in Teacher of the Year events. This triggered a terrible series of events that ultimately resulted in Brett losing his job, his livelihood, and his ability to serve his students, who were always his highest priority. Knowing that bit of information will help you, will provide some context for the video that follows. So without further ado, I would love to ask Paul, our wonderful producer on the Microsoft Teams end, to roll the first video and then the second one.
I did not go to college to be a teacher at first. I took a job substitute teaching. I had no background. I had never had any desire to be a teacher. It was just one of the few things that were available. And my first day I taught kindergarten, and it was the most fun you could ever imagine. And then it just continued from there, and I started getting tougher and tougher classes. I was walking into behavior rooms where they couldn't get a teacher to stay more than a day, and I had no trouble in these classrooms, because the hardest part of teaching is classroom management. The hardest thing about teaching angry kids is de-escalation. It's a science, but it's also an art. We made a program completely built around the needs of our students, but we ignored all of the, you can't do that, you can't do that. We just said, why not? We'll find a way to do it.
So many of my students were seen as, not the ideal student. So I worked with a lot of students with learning disabilities, and then when I went on to the same high school where it fed into, I taught refugee students, I taught students who were transitioning out of jail. We're not seen as like the kind of kid that you want in your class because they don't make you look good. You will always and forever be branded a failure by your scores because these are not kids that make you look good. I helped my students see that all the things that were right with them, all the things that were good about them, not all the things that were wrong and the problems and all of that. And I also wanted them to see themselves as people who could affect their communities.
So the first time I saw a possibility model, I had retired from working, and I was working with LGBT youth. I met teenagers that said, yeah, hey, I'm non-binary, I'm non-conforming, and my pronouns are they, them. And I had that aha moment. It was a younger person that gave me the thoughts and ideas that, that's kind of where I fit, and I never knew there was a name for that, or I could be that person. So that was really important, had a huge impact on me at a much later stage in life.
When I was 15, my best friend came out to me, went home and killed himself that weekend. And it was hard. I have carried his face in my mind my whole life because I learned very young there are people who'd rather be dead than grow up gay. And that's because of how people treat them, not because of themselves, but because of their fear of what people are going to do to them. So I was standing there at the White House with the International Press Corps. Remember, I had the Teacher of the Year from Georgia and Minnesota were right in front of me, and I said, pardon me, ladies, I'm coming out of the closet. And I was already out of the closet, but I was coming out of a bigger closet, I guess. So I stepped up to the microphones and I made a statement about LGBT youth and anti-gay laws and how they are harming our students. And I drew a line in the sand with my school district, basically. And that was, you're not going to shut me up. My being an openly gay Teacher of the Year is going to save some kids' lives.
I'll never forget, after I retired, I was at a bar watching a drag show. Some of my friends said, oh, let's go up and give this person $1. So we go up and we give the person $1. We're sitting back down, and the person gets back up there and says, I really want to thank all my friends and fans that are here, and this has been great. I especially want to thank my assistant principal that's sitting right out there in the audience. And then they came over and he said, you always listened to me and you always made me feel valued. And this is a trans guy, that's performing. And he said, I just can't thank you enough for saving me in high school. I really didn't know that I did that. But, what you do and what you say is seen 100% of the time. And I'm really grateful that I could help this person survive. and be the great artists that they are today.
When my seniors at Paladuro High School would leave me, one of the last things that I did was I read them 2 books. One was The Lorax, and one was Hansel and Gretel. And the reason I read Hansel and Gretel is because it's sort of like my deep story. It is the diamond that I hold, because that story foregrounds the ability of children to take their own initiative and their own agency, and for children to be their own heroes and fight their own monsters. And I would give that to them and say, this is the story I want to sort of tuck inside your backpack as you leave me, so you'll always remember you can face the monster, you can defeat the monster, and you can find your way out of the forest. You know, you can do this, you have the tools to do it.
I got a message from one of my coworkers, and she said, Google your name and the word Nigeria. So I Googled it, and it was the Nigerian Times, and they were running a story about me being fired. But they showed the pictures of Mike and I in the Rose Festival parade on the car with the flowers and the crowds. And I looked at that, and in Nigeria, gay people are being executed still. Gay people in Africa are being murdered right and left. That day in Nigeria, people saw in the newspaper Mike and I in the parade. They saw us at our wedding. That's hopeful for people who live with the threat of being killed all the time. And I knew from that minute I had won. That was so much positivity going someplace that didn't have it, that was worth it. All of it was worth it for that.
I've been teaching for 10 years. When I started teaching 10 years ago, I definitely felt more resistance and more hostility in the classroom, in the undergraduate classroom, to gay issues in general. A lot of people at my campus didn't even know what LGBT meant as an acronym. About 2, 3, 5 years ago at the most, I noticed a relaxation and a shift in my classrooms, with people being less homophobic. Not everybody, people being more generous and open. And I'm talking people from all over the world. My classroom is people from Ethiopia and Senegal and Malaysia and Ecuador, all in the same classroom. I'm not saying that there's not a lot of resistance and fear and misunderstanding and homophobia and fear of women's power all there. There certainly is. And I feel it's changing. I do feel, whether we would call it the bi tribe or whatever we would call it, I do feel that people's understanding and generous spirit about sexual diversity is growing. And that gives me hope. If I didn't go to class and teach, I would be somewhere hiding under the blankets, wailing, depressed, and just not feeling good. My students, the 18-year-olds especially, give me hope.
Well, I think you can see me again, hopefully. It's Mason. Thank you, Paul, for playing those 2 videos. You 3, and Shanna, who is not here with us today, unfortunately, but Brett, Elaine, and Loraine, watching those videos, I swear I'm going to never get tired of watching those videos if I watch them 1,000 times, because they fill me with such joy and such hope and such gratitude to you all for being in the roles you've been in and for providing leadership and openness and vulnerability and hope to your students. And the beautiful thing, of course, is that in turn, your students provide those same much needed experiences and emotions for you. I'm looking back and watching these videos and I'm thinking a brief moment of personal history. I went to high school in Los Angeles in the mid 1970s, 45 years ago. Looking back now, I know that I had two queer teachers. My English and modern European history teacher, Miss O'Brien, was definitely a lesbian and is alive today running a bookstore in Monterey, California. And one of these days I've got to get up there and visit her and see if she'll be nice to me for the first time ever, because she was mean. And then my high school French teacher, Mr. Johnson, was a wonderful Black man from the Caribbean, I believe, who was a native French speaker. And he was also gay. And I know that now, but at the time I was so terrified and so closeted that, of course, any hint, any suggestion that he was gay, I had to push as far away from me as I could. So times have changed. And again, it fills my heart with joy and pride to welcome you all to the panel today. And one of the terms that I learned by putting this video together was a term that Elaine used. You used the term possibility model. And I had never heard that term before, but now it's in my mind, it's in my heart. And I wanted to just ask each of you, anybody can jump in first. Well, actually, let me start with Loraine, because I think these things flow better if I call on somebody. Loraine, you talked about how your students are possibility models for you. They give you hope. And I wondered if you could expand upon that a little bit and also maybe suggest how you've been a possibility model for your students.
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
You know, I want to speak from the other side of the blanket, because since that thing was filmed, I have been exploring retirement, and now some of my models are in their 90s and 100s, as well as the 18-year-olds. And I still really miss the classroom, and it lives inside me. And I think as a possibility model myself, I gave permission to a lot of students to feel all right about not knowing their label, not knowing how to choose sides, not wanting to choose sides, not wanting there to be sides, and to say, oh, well, if I'm attracted to more than one gender or more than one, some kind of possibility, maybe it's all right for me to explore that and be curious about it. And maybe there's a safe place in this classroom or other classrooms for me to just be me and feel what it feels like. And basically my students are my possibility models as well.
Loraine, I want to highlight the fact that as the round circular sign behind you indicates, you are bi and proud. And I want to give a shout out and ask you a question about the bisexual community, because I believe that the bi community that has never received or has not received adequate love traditionally within the LGBTQ acronym, that it may be the bisexual community that is in fact the possibility model for the rest of the community. Because you stand up and you say, you can be somewhere in the middle. You can be confused. You can be both and. Can you expand upon that idea if you agree with it a little bit?
I do agree with it. I don't agree that everybody's bi, because everybody is whoever they are, wherever they want to be at any point in their life. And there's a lot of fear and stigmatizing of bisexuals and bisexuality that we need to get over. I just watched the Pride series that's on FX, and it almost entirely erased bisexuals, except for a little bit of Margaret Cho and, you know, a few other things. But it didn't represent that bisexual people, particularly younger people, are the majority of LGBT people. And a lot of people who are transgender identified in some way also identify as bi or pansexual or, you know, attracted to more than one gender. So we need to be able to talk about that. And at least we were able to talk about it when we were doing safer sex education in the 90s, and when we are still needing to do safer sex education today. But we have to talk about how people are intimate and how they explore, you know, their identities. So we got to talk about sex, guys.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Loraine. I'm going to move focus to Elaine. And again, I thank you for introducing me to the term possibility model. And I love your story of your students helping you to come into the full awareness and knowledge and understanding of who you are in this world. And then you also told the story about you supporting that trans performer, unknowingly to you, probably. Do you remember when, Elaine, your first awareness of that kind of interplay between teachers, students, and administrators kind of came into your awareness in terms of you co-inspiring each other?
I think, wow, yeah, that's a tough one, because the visibility piece, you're there, everybody sees you, kids know, they know before you say anything to them. And listening to them is really, really important, because, you never know what is going through someone's mind when they're telling you their story. So I think that listening piece is super critical all across the board, and not judging. Listening and not judging, especially with the high school kids that I worked with. That was, I think, critical, and why today when I see many of those former high school students, it amazes me the things that they tell me about what happened back when they were in school and I was their teacher or their administrator.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a difference, Elaine, between the roles you play? You've been a teacher and you've been an administrator, and to my mind, the assistant principal in my mind was called the vice principal. It was Mr. Kinsella, and he was the one who busted me for trying to cut class. He was scary, and he was patrolling the halls. And a teacher I could have a relationship with, but Mr. Kinsella was almost entirely in my mind a disciplinarian and a guy to be scared of. But do you think that as administrator, you can play certain roles for students that are different from the roles you play as teacher and vice versa?
A little bit. A student is going to be more, I think, upfront and honest with a teacher that they can build a relationship with. But my goal as an administrator was to do the discipline, but make sure that the student understood and their behavior changed. And so that listening piece was important, but also being there for that kid. I'll never forget the kid that I had to suspend out 10 days long-term with a disciplinary hearing, who just started crying in my office. And I said, "What's wrong? Are you upset that you've disappointed your parents?" And he said, "No, I'm upset that I've disappointed you." So to me, that said a lot of, even though I disciplined that kid, I built a relationship with him so that he could move forward.
That's a beautiful story.
But not all administrators look at that way. But I think it's important.
Yeah. It leads me to believe that you are an extraordinary administrator.
I don't know.
Brett, you, as I mentioned before the video and as was referenced in the video, you were fully out as a special education teacher. You were working with the kids that effectively nobody else wanted. And I wonder, in terms of, one of the things you were able to offer them was a kind of a bigger vision of what their lives could be without any limitations based on what other people had seen, whatever they might be carrying through their lives. I wonder what was the interplay between you being out and you being able to play that role for them. Did you embody, as an out educator, a certain freedom from externally imposed limitations that maybe help them to get there more easily?
Well, it's really interesting when you look at my case, because unlike a lot of other LGBTQ educators, I was in a very small program with children who had severe and multiple disabilities, and I had a transition program. They were 18 to 21. So I didn't have that same school around me where a lot of these topics may naturally come up. So for me, it really hinged on being named Teacher of the Year. Now, see, prior to that, I don't talk about it a lot, but
put myself through school building furniture and was highlighted on some TV programs about that. So the local gay paper had done articles on me, big pictures. I was out there. There was no question. And, what happened was I suddenly got this amazing award that meant I was representing all of the teachers in my state and all of the students in my state. And it did mean that I was going out and having that conversation about LGBTQ issues, because now I was representing on a much larger scale. But in my own classroom, it wasn't something that we really dealt with. So my case was more, I was jettisoned, I was picked up out of my classroom when I won the award and put in the national spotlight. And suddenly the interest in who I was much broader from the press. And I had a domestic partner at the time. Marriage wasn't legal yet, but I was pushed up into that forefront. Gay marriage was on the ballot in Oregon the year I was Teacher of the Year. And I was contacted within 2 weeks of being named Teacher of the Year and said, we're sending a postcard to every registered voter in the state that says the Teacher of the Year can't marry his partner. Do you want to make a statement? And from there on, I was front and center for that media circus. So my case is so different, but it really became, again, though, when they tried to silence me, they weren't silencing just me in my classroom, they were silencing the representative of all teachers in my state. By taking away my voice, they took away the voice of the children I was advocating for. And that couldn't stand. It's good.
Yeah. Needless to say, this will not come as a surprise to any of you or anybody watching this, but teachers have been spotlighted by homophobic and transphobic and biphobic people from day one as the worst people that you could possibly expose your children to if they were in any way, shape, or form living outside of the traditional cis-normative and heteronormative society roles. Famous ballot initiatives in California, the Briggs Initiative in 1978, that would have made it mandatory and legal to fire any person, any teacher who was suspected of being gay. In Oregon, ballot measure 9 in 1993, that was equally horrific on a broader scale. What do you think, the three of you, and maybe I'll start back with you, Loraine, what do you think has changed in the years you've been teaching and in the years you've been alive in terms of how queer teachers are able to be openly queer in public school settings, and what hasn't changed, which we all know is probably still quite a lot? What are your thoughts on that, Loraine?
Well, one thing we did at my community college outside Washington, D.C. is we organized, the professors organized, and we ended up organizing with the staff and the students just to support each other, although I don't recommend that. It's really better when you have separate groups. But we organized because we wanted rights for domestic partners or any kind of partner. And we organized because we wanted health insurance coverage. We wanted to feel safe and not attacked, with hate crimes on our campuses, which still happens, but it's happening less. I see a lot more respect and tolerance from our colleagues, our peers, through our professions, our disciplines than I used to. And there's more opportunities for gaining credibility in any field, but particularly the fields that relate to the cultural studies and the sexuality studies that a lot of us end up teaching in. Although I'm glad that people don't only teach in those fields.
Interesting. Elaine, you are the lone representative of the middle part of America on this panel at the moment. Shanna, of course, the other teacher that we were featured in the video, she lived and taught in Amarillo, Texas, so that was a whole story unto itself. But coming from the St. Louis metropolitan area, I don't honestly know what kind of schools you taught in and what the makeup of your student body generally was, whether these were from more traditionally conservative suburban areas, whether they were more urban. Can you kind of paint a picture and maybe give a little description of what it was like in your school and communities vis-a-vis the possibility of openly gay or queer teachers?
So I taught in the St. Louis metro area, but I taught in St. Charles County, which is west of St. Louis and very suburbia. And I was with my district for 25 years and still very it was very conservative, but the movement to being more open has happened within the last, I retired 8 years ago, so I would say within the last probably 12 to 15 years. And I think the support comes from the top. And when you have support from the superintendent and the administrators, I think that the faculty feels more able to be out. The last high school that I worked at during retirement, where I did a long-term sub, there were 3 openly gay teachers plus myself, and 3 of the 4 of us were married. So it was really nice to be accepted and to be able to be out and open like that in the workplace, where I wasn't able to do that earlier on in my career, or I wouldn't have been, and those other people wouldn't have been either.
Yeah. When you say the support came from the top, what would you, assuming and knowing that some administrators as well as some teachers are going to be watching this program, what would you say to administrators in terms of what kind of leadership can make the biggest difference? And is that, I assume that's what you mean by the top.
Yes.
So what does it look like for an administrator to provide leadership that is going to filter down in a positive way to the entire district or the entire school?
So I think that at the district administration level and then down to the building administrators, I think that cultural competency training is key importance, and backing up your teachers if there's a problem, especially with conservative parents. I think that's crucial. We did Trans Day of Remembrance in St. Charles County about 5 years ago. And one of the people that organized that asked me to speak, and 3 members of the school board were there. And I think that was really crucial and really important and very supportive. So everybody needs to get on board, I think.
Yeah. Brett, in your case, tell the audience a little briefly, obviously, what happened, how you were given the message by your immediate superior that, in fact, you could not be gay now that you were going to be stepping out into a statewide and national spotlight. Just recount that story, and maybe how that's a sad and obviously negative example of how administrators freak out or clamp down or go through some negative process whereby they're trying to squelch any possibility of open queer identities.
Well, again, my case is going to be so strange in some ways, but I gave one of my very first speeches as Teacher of the Year. My superintendent sent my supervisor, and she's the head of my department, to see the speech. And when I got finished, and in my speech, I thanked my partner briefly, just very briefly. And I was speaking to adults in the afternoon. I wasn't talking to children or anything. And she called me up minutes after. She got up while I was finishing my speech. She got up and left the room. And then my phone rings a few minutes later, and she tells me that if I didn't shut my mouth, that someone was going to shoot me in the head. And then said she meant it, that I was going to be killed if I said I was gay in public. Then I was pulled into her office and given this list of rules. I wasn't allowed to speak or write anything without her permission. In this attempt to silence me. The New York Times had called and asked to do an interview, and my district said no. So here I was, the first special education teacher to be Teacher of the Year. I'm out advocating mostly for kids with special needs, but I'm not allowed to say a word without their permission. And then the second 2 rules that followed, they pushed me to my limit, and that was I could meet with no group that she didn't approve of. The first time they used that to deny me, an appearance was for a GSA, where I was going to speak about suicide prevention. And I get an email from my district saying I'm not allowed to attend because meeting with those students, and I'm quoting their paperwork, has no value to this district. And then finally, I was ordered that I would bring all of my personal mail from home for her to open and read. All of these things are illegal. They're all illegal. And in my case, I refused eventually. I tried to quit and they wouldn't accept my resignation. So I was trapped and I decided, well, I'm going to do exactly what I plan to do. And that is, I call it showing a possible future. So it's very similar terminology, but I knew that every LGBTQ youth that saw me with my husband or my domestic partner, they would get that possible future. They would see where their life could go. And as I continued to fight, the spotlight just grew bigger and bigger. It was first at the White House, but Mike and I were the first gay couple to ride in the Portland Rose Festival. I'm under an order. If I say one word they haven't approved, I'll be fired. And we rode in a parade in front of 400,000 Portlanders with another 500,000 watching on TV. And you know, it was a message to my district that they were not going to take away my voice. They were not going to do that. But I do have to piggyback on something you said, Mason, and that was that those conservative people put a spotlight on LGBTQ teachers, and I disagree. What they're doing is they're sicking their dogs on us. They're promoting us up into the public sphere in ways so that their people can attack us. Last year in June, I got threats that were so bad that during Joe Biden's inauguration on January 20th, we were advised to be out of our home for the day before and the day of the inauguration. And the police were at my mother's house because I was getting threats that they were going to rape and kill my mother. So that conservative spotlight, those conservative people on Twitter that put out your words in the ways they want to use them, they're not drawing a spotlight and they're not trying to throw a stone. They're trying to get all of the people who think like them to attack you in the most vicious way they can. It's bad enough that here at my house, if we call 911, the police have it in their system that it's a possible assassination attack and it's a multiple car response to my house. And that's because I'm an out gay teacher. Now, I'm really out. And I got pushed out in ways I never expected. But because of that, you know, I have to deal with these people who continually and constantly threaten me. My car tires have been slashed at my house in the middle of the night. So it's not a spotlight that they're doing. So I just wanted to make sure you saw the flip side of what they're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm adjusting my camera because a huge shadow is there we go. Brett, I appreciate that clarification, and that's super important. In fact, what they're doing is they're using you as proverbial red meat to fire up the proverbial base. And so the people whom they claim to care about the most, the children, they're sacrificing their children's educations to try to fire up their political base in the form of demonizing the teachers, the very same people who are working their tails off to benefit those children. So it's a horrific situation. I'm so sorry to hear this is continuing, and that I honestly didn't know that it was continuing to as recently as this year with that kind of threat level. We have a question, and I wanted to take this opportunity to mention that we are very excited to have questions from the audience. And we have a terrific member of the Outwards team, Jack McCarthy, who is moderating and posting questions to me. And one of them comes from a user named Ethan. And Ethan asks, this is quite a dramatic shift of topic, but really, really important. Have you seen any efforts in your own educational environments to make using chosen names and pronouns more systematized? What have you witnessed? What haven't you witnessed in that regard? Brett, let me start with you, and then I'll circle back the way that I came.
Oh boy! All right, everyone's gonna give me a dirty look here, but when I'm teaching primary grades, oftentimes I'm working with minority students, and I always have used sir and ma'am, and ladies and gentlemen. It's in my vocabulary, and I've done that my whole career, in the hopes that my students get that hunger to feel what it's like to be spoken to with respect. And I might be the first white person who calls one of my students sir. And I think that's incredibly important, but it is not gender neutral, but it still comes out sometimes. So I was doing summer school I had a kindergarten class, and that afternoon, some of the third graders were coming in. And I said, ladies and gentlemen, please come over here and line up. And this little kid raised their hand and said, you need to be gender specific with our classroom. We have somebody who is transgender. This is a third grader, and she totally called me out. I was never so proud in my whole life of a kid I never met before being brave enough to stand up to me, the giant teacher in the gym, and tell me that I wasn't doing a good enough job. It was an amazing way to be called out, and it's actually made me do a much better job. But I do still about it.
Thank you, Brett. That's a great anecdote. Thank you. Elaine, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts. It's Ethan asked if it was systematized, and in the district that I was in, it's not unless a kid has an advocate for them. And I became an advocate for quite a few students who wanted to use chosen names and pronouns, of course, getting permission from the parent. And then I would take the student into the guidance office. We would change it in the system, in the computer system, and we would send an email to all the teachers. The guidance counselor was in on it, and it was changed in a flash. But unless a kid advocated for that or had somebody to help them, it didn't happen. In addition, I know that there are some teachers that ask that in their classrooms, but it's not consistent across the board. And I signed my email with pronouns the last 3 years that I was there, and I never got any, never had any problem with that. And I also had a guidance counselor who was sending an email out and to parents and some staff about a student, and they said, not Mr., not Ms., what do I refer to you as? And I said Miss. And so that was an education also.
Interesting. Super interesting. Thank you, Elaine. And how about you, Loraine? What have you been noticing at the community college level in this regard?
Well, our college was making progress towards the University of Maryland model, I will say, and they're not there yet, but they are at least discussing it on an administrative level. And when I say the University of Maryland model, I'm not holding them up as an ideal. I don't really know how they compare to other universities, but I know that at least 6 or 7 years ago, their LGBT staff resource people came and spoke to us at a staff training, and they told us, listen, it's not impossible to do. It's easy to mess with to reprogram a database system. It's really easy. Students can name their own pronouns and their own names, and it's easy to do. You just have to figure out how to do it with IT, and it is a lot easier, but it's doing the training and the communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to take a pause and ask you all, I want to kind of plant the possibility, speaking of possibility models, that you each might have a question for any other person on the panel, because I love the idea of educators talking shop in a way with educators. So I just want to offer that possibility that if any point a question of your own bubbles to the surface, I want to make space for that in a few minutes here. I want to go back to some other questions that I had. What do you think that as LGBTQ teachers, when we interviewed Loraine 5 years ago, we had what we called our final 4 set of questions. I don't know if you remember those, Loraine. You were probably so glad that it was almost over. But we revised them recently because one of our interview subjects, I think a woman named Jewel Gomez from the Bay Area, she talked during her interview about what she called the queer superpower. She told a couple of great anecdotes to illustrate what she meant by that. And one of the questions I had for you all is, what do you ascribe to the notion of us queer people having something, by virtue of having to kind of find our way in the world, that makes us, in fact, uniquely qualified and blessed in a way to the students who are, you know, in your charge, to the students that you interact with, that you bring something that they frankly can't get from a straight teacher? I don't mean to be too black and white about that, but I wondered what might be what is that special something, that glowing emerald in our chests that we bring into that classroom and that school environment? Elaine, let me start with you this time.
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. Queer superpower. I think being able to interact with all different kinds of students and being able to listen to them and being able to kind of help them push through situations that they might struggle with, and encouraging them and pushing them further than they think that they can push themselves. I had a student that I had interacted with for 3 years, and when COVID hit last year, I wasn't back in the school, and she emailed me in May. She had picked up her cap and gown and told me that she was really grateful that I had been there because she didn't think that she would be graduating if I hadn't pushed her. And she was a kid that was chronically late to school all the time, and gotten in trouble for it all the time. But you push, I think the ability to have understanding and push them farther than they can really see themselves going.
How, in that case, because this is, we have a term, a joking term in our Outwards team. I always thank them for being on time for meetings. I call it practicing radical punctuality. And Jack will probably be giggling or laughing right now. But Loraine, Elaine, how did you push that particular student? What was your method that ended up being successful?
I was confrontational with her, but I was also understanding with her. You know, so we had that bargain back and forth, and it became a joke. And I was there the first 6 weeks of her senior year, and she was not late any day those first 6 weeks. And it was because the previous 2 years I had been there periodically, and kind of gotten her to realize what she needed to do. And part of the issue too, she was caretaking for a younger sibling and had to get them off to school. And so, we had that conversation, and I listened and I asked her questions so that she could see what she needed to do and why it was so important.
Maybe just that delving 1 layer, 2 layers below the surface to know there was a younger sibling at home just was all she needed to know that you were her ally in this journey, in this situation. Oh,
absolutely. I think so.
Yeah. Loraine, what's your take on the queer superpower? Especially as you all as educators bring that into your classrooms. Oh, Loraine, you're muted. I think you're still muted.
No, I lost. Okay.
You're good.
Okay. Now can you hear me?
Yep.
I lost the little buttons. Thank you, Microsoft. What I really want to say is that I was aging and increasingly experiencing my own disabilities as I taught. And I learned that if I could be vulnerable and teach from my vulnerability about my sexuality in a way that was communicable in a classroom appropriately. And if I could do that, I could normalize for the students being comfortable in their own bodies, no matter where they were at. And I think that's really, really important about coming out and about staying out, to feel, you got to be safe. Students would ask me, should I come out to my parents? And I said, are they paying all your tuition? And they would say yes, and I'd say, well, I'm not sure. You should come out unless you're willing to forfeit that. But we would talk about the coming out process, and it's not an event, it's a lifelong process. You know, so I think just giving students permission to be themselves.
Yeah.
Not that anybody can give you permission, you have to claim that, but seeing other people do it is encouraging.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I was at a yoga retreat this past weekend, and one of the attributes that I most appreciate about my yoga teacher is this quality of giving permission. And I literally thought to myself, yeah, but really no one can give permission, and yet you create space. And I think that's kind of what that giving of it's making more space for people to be more of who they are. And I can easily imagine you, Loraine, doing that through your own vulnerability, which is, of course, the leadership quality that is never appreciated enough in the world, making ourselves vulnerable. How about you, Brett? You've been incredibly vulnerable. During your interview, you were very vulnerable, which I appreciated so much. Is that a quality that you feel like enabled you somehow to be the person you are with this very special group of students that you taught? You're getting all blushy. I don't mean to.
I am, because it's so not true in so many ways. I'm a very private person. I have always, kind of kept myself with a very small circle of friends. I moved a lot as a kid. I went to 13 schools, so I never had a big social life. I always had, a smaller life, at least until high school. I went to one high school. But when you ask about the secret or our superpower, I'm sitting here trying to think of what that could be for me, and you're gonna laugh, but I pictured a disco ball. And when you shine a light on a disco ball, the light goes everywhere, just like that. And I think that an LGBT teacher, Q in there as well, has a similar way of working as like a disco ball, because we may put a rainbow sticker on our door because we have one student we're thinking maybe, but every kid who walks by that sticker sees it. And it means that every gay kid sees that maybe they're not alone, or that they have a friend. But all the straight kids see that somebody who's smart, a teacher, supports gay people, and that makes that a message. And that is kind of our superpowers, that when we help one student as a teacher, and it's not just about LGBT issues, it's everything. But when we help one student in a visible way, like Elaine said, you're always out there, they're always being seen. And I think that teachers forget how many people see them. My old school, my last day, I did a little announcement in the hallway because I had hallway duty for the middle school. And I had decided when I got there, because I was new, nobody knew me, I was just going to say goodbye to every kid that walked by. And they thought I was so weird at first, but by the end, those kids were waiting for it when they came down. The kids who were shy were grinning because they knew I was going to get them. And on my last day, this one boy who never spoke to me the entire year, but I had seen at a GSA meeting, he walked by me, didn't look at me, got about 5 feet away, and then he stopped, he turned around, right there in a very full hallway, hugged me. And I had not known that, I choke up so easy, guys, I'm sorry, but I had just not known that my impact was, you just don't know how many people you're helping. And it's a teacher, 100% the life of a teacher.
Yeah, and you really don't know, because as Elaine's story illustrated, years later, going to this drag show and one of their students thanking them from the stage, Elaine would have never known until that moment that student carried such a feeling of gratitude towards Elaine and their work. I want to take a moment and see if any of you has a question for any of the other panelists, or for both of your all of your fellow panelists. Fellow, that's a term that's probably going to go the way of the dinosaur pretty soon. Your co-panelists, how's that? Any questions from you? We don't have any other questions from the audience, although, hello audience, we're definitely open to hearing them. But how about you all? Any questions you want to ask each other?
I do want to say that after seeing Lorraine's video, that I'm very disappointed in your hair today.
I am too. We can't get the retirement community to do hair like that. And my students are the ones who taught me how to do it. My students taught me so much. My students have been my teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Thank you for that. Thank you both for that. Brett, I really relate to that hair envy. Yeah, Loraine, I hope you're able to find other ways to, celebrate yourself through your hair.
Okay, I'll work on it.
Okay. Okay. Other thoughts from the panelists for other co-panelists, or as we near the end, we've actually only got 5 minutes to go. I do want to ask you if you could name a single thing that you feel like you learned most from your students. If you could pinpoint maybe an anecdote, kind of like the one that Brett just shared, or any other anecdote. Does anything come to mind in terms of like a nugget that a student gave you that you still carry around with you in your heart to this day?
I have giant rocks. They're not nuggets even. I'll just jump in because as a special ed teacher and an LGBTQ educator, it means that I've worked so many years with probably the students who get picked on the most and who have the potential for the darkest future. I mean, we've all seen the suicide rates of LGBTQ youth, and I can tell you that my special ed kids get picked on even more than that. And I have watched resilience come from kids who are at the very bottom of the pecking order, who have continued to try and who've continued to try to please me and do a good job in my classroom, and all for the positives that I give to them. Maybe I just remain the only positive person in their life at times when they're in a lot of trouble or things are not going well. And for me, I had the power to give my fight, to put that fight out against my district, because I had seen my students fight so hard to hold a pencil, or to be able to take a bite of food, and I've seen them work so hard that I knew I could do that too. It gave me great power. Those kids give me great power.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you. Loraine, what comes to mind for you?
I'm thinking about the women's movement and what I learned about communication and facilitation, and that when my students started challenging me and saying, "Professor, you don't know what you're talking about with gender roles and gender terms," I would say, "Come up to the front of the classroom," and I would say, "Teach." And I'd give them the computer controls that, in the classroom computer, and I'd say, "Show us what you're talking about." And they gave me so much courage. I hate online teaching, and yet I had to do online teaching for money. And I had like a snotty attitude towards it, but I was watching how, they play with it. And, they taught me so much about, don't take the computer seriously, learn how to use it as a tool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that. Turning work into play. Uh-huh. And Elaine, any final thoughts from you? What single or multiple nuggets or boulders did your students bestow upon you?
So I think I've told most of the major ones, but the St. Louis metropolitan area is pretty large, but it's also small town, because I can't go anywhere without running into some kind of former student, and they will recognize me, and we will have a conversation, and they will remember something that I said or something that I did, or I will remember something they said or did. And it's just really interesting, and it just blows me away sometimes how much of an impact you just really don't know that you have with these kids.
Mm-hmm.
So St. Charles is on the other side of the river, and those kids don't come over to St. Louis City that often, but apparently they do, because every time I go somewhere public, I see a former student of some sort or another.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, I can imagine that being a very enlivening experience. Just to have that reinforcement that all these seeds you sprinkled, they're sprouting, they're growing, they're moving into their own lives, and they're happy to see you. And I'm positive in your case, Elaine, as well as in yours, Loraine and Brett, your students are happy to see you when they see your face, whether it's online or it's on the street or anywhere else. So I want to thank you all so much for participating, for sharing your stories with Outwards. It's been just an enormous pleasure to be with you for this hour. I want to say thank you again to Microsoft for supporting this event, for supporting Outwards in our desire to interview LGBTQ elders across the country, educators, pioneers, and elders. I want to thank the Outwards team, who are magnificent, including Jack McCarthy, including but not limited to Jack, along our Director of Operations, Tom Bliss, our editor, oh my gosh, Christy Taiwo Makanjula, our other editor, Florencia Marano, who prepared the videos that you watched, and all the other members of our team. I wish you all well. Thank you again from Outwards and from Microsoft, and we'll see you again in the classroom or on the street. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.